Hello everybody, it's Friday the 13th, but it's a Thursday, which can only mean one thing. It's episode 2 of Liftoff, where we talk to our space chums about stuff which isn't talked about enough. So in today's episode, we're going to talk sustainability. I've got a very interesting panel for you. So for those of you who are TikTok followers and the like, we have Ria, Rocket Ria. Fantastic, we'll hear more from you later. And we have Fionagh Thomson from Durham University. Some very good views on sustainability. Looking forward to that. And of course, my old chum here, Ray Stott from Space Specialists. So without further ado, introduce yourself to the space followers at Liftoff.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I'm Ria, or Rocket Ria. I am an astronomy and planetary science student. I also study psychology, and I'm going to go into a PhD in neuroscience because I want to examine astronauts who go on deep space missions. That's the plan. And meanwhile, I run my YouTube channel talking about rockets, space science, and I interview people who have been on analog missions or, done something interesting in space. And I talk a lot about sustainability, actually. I have a TikTok channel where I talk about daily space industry news. And I also work for a company which focuses on space sustainability. It's a space situational awareness company.
Fantastic. We could have a conversation with you for an entire episode, perhaps for season 2. Fiona.
Yes, hello. My name's Fionagh Thomson. I work in astrophysics at Durham, but I'm a cuckoo in the nest. I am an environmental ethicist, human geographer, philosopher of technology. I'm particularly interested in the darker side of things. I tend to look at the unintended consequences, the good, the bad, what we call the perverse, which means things end up being the opposite of what they meant. I'm less interested in holding a view and trying to find out what's actually happening, not what do we think is happening, but what's actually happening on the ground. So I look at dark matter in astrophysics, and I also look at dark skies, but then the darker side of satellites, including sustainability.
Again, another conversation in itself. I mean, do we go into the shadows, the dark, steamy side of space where stuff isn't talked about? Perhaps there's another episode there in the making. And Ray, good to see you back again.
Ray Stott from Space Specialists. I'm the co-founder of the company that provides key services to the global space industry around recruitment, so getting a space job, doing training and consulting, as well as our events business. And we're based in SciTech Daresbury in the northwest of England, near Warrington. And also we have an office in Australia. My background is 35 years in the industry. I'm passionate about the satellites, launch vehicle and space robotics, and very interested to contribute with you today. The other hat that I wear sometimes, Bruce, is I'm chairman of the Industry Advisory Board at the University of Manchester. So we're helping students get into the space sector and also trying to make sure the courses in the aerospace and space area are fit for purpose.
Ray, thank you very much for that. What's particularly exciting about this episode for me is we have 3 genuinely different perspectives on this particular subject matter. So let the good times start. I think it's all good to have a starter for 10, if we're watching well-known television programs. And what do we mean by sustainability? Because I spoke to my other half about this. She came at one thing. It can be whatever, but let's hear it from yourselves, guys. Ria.
Space sustainability encompasses a lot of things. So we want space to be accessible and usable in the future as well. So obviously we need satellites around Earth, but we want not to congest those orbits, not to endanger space infrastructure that could be detrimental to Earth infrastructure as well in the future. But nowadays there's more and more research into what actually rocket launches do to our atmosphere, so I would include that here as well. And I think that's my take on it, but I'm sure Fiona knows more.
No. Well, that's why we have a wide audience. We're a broad church here at Liftoff. As you can see from the background, we're up in space today. But Fiona, your take on sustainability. I know you've got some interesting views on this.
I am, but I'm going to answer you. The more I learn, the less I know.
True.
I really do feel that way. It's fascinating. It's really is. So I also come from, I'm a forester, so I spent a long time, my PhD was also about land sustainability. So the whole conversation I bring with me from the environmental field, which is a bit of a mess, to be honest with you. So to sustain just means to maintain something, So what are we maintaining? So space was built by the military, Cold War. Are we maintaining the status quo? Are we maintaining dominant nations? When people talk about space sustainability, they often mean keeping the traffic jam, the orbits flowing, but for who? Who are we keeping it flowing for? So space sustainability, to me, is mirroring some of the problems that we had in environmental sustainability. I find it nebulous and unhelpful, to be completely honest with you. And it's not about necessarily disagreeing with what people are doing. It's just it's really difficult to have a good conversation, a good critical conversation, unless you know what you're talking about, because then people are spending all their time talking from different points of view. There is something there's something in sort of the social research. It's called a boundary term, and space sustainability is that if people come from the same field, they know what they're talking about. So when you have people are in space situational awareness, they're often talking about keeping the orbits flowing. So when they use the word, it's called a boundary object. But when somebody comes in from a different field, it gets confusing because they've got a completely different point of view. So actually how it's used and kind of misused, there's a lot of green. My biggest concern is the greenwashing that goes on with the bringing things from the Earth sustainability discussions.
And we'll talk about that, the use of language a little bit later on.
But sustain is what is it that we're sustaining? That's all it means, sustainability.
Because are we protecting? Are we mitigating? The conversation is going to be a very fun next half hour, and we'll come back to that. Ray.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. It's so broad, and what do you define it as? And it's interesting to hear the perspectives of both Rhea and Fiona. But I think as long as we incorporate and encompass everything, so really look at the 360 aspect of space. And when we talk about that, we need to understand what do we mean by space? What is ecosystem? What is space? Is another ecosystem like land, air, and sea. But so we're also going into the solar system and doing exploration. So sustainability really has so many touch points with what we're doing in the sector. And I think it affects not just the big things that we think about, the satellites and the launch vehicles, but you touched on it earlier, the sort of new area of things coming back into our atmosphere. New economies are starting to happen, like we're going to be bringing stuff back. It's not just launching. And that is a whole learning curve. So sustainability covers not just the satellites, the rockets, but also how we control things on the ground, the so-called ground segment. How do we make sure things like data centers and things are also sustainable? There's talk about putting data centers into space to be more sustainable and less power hungry on the ground. So it's a very interesting angle. But then there's what we call the downstream of the sector, the data aspect of what space does. And how does the data also become sustainable, and how do we treat the ecosystem around the management of that data, and also the data explosion and the data age that we're in today? So it's extremely broad, but we can also, I think, be clever, because we've already learned a lot of things already by being the humans that we are. And I think it's incumbent on us to think about and preempt a lot of things. So I think it's broad, but we have some pathway signs that will help us, and we need to keep the communication between us to make sure that we protect what is such an important Earth system and the solar system as we go in to explore the solar system.
And which ties in very neatly with what Rhea was talking about, into long, deep space missions, for want of a better word. Fiona, talking to you before this, one of the things, and I was trying to understand get a clearer view on your perspective. Can we prioritise what we mean by sustainability? Is it trying to mitigate the creation of further rubbish in space, etc.? What are your views on prioritising those activities?
I think it's not one place; it's multiple places. Yep. So when you were talking, you were framing it from a very specific point of view. So I have a business background, but it's framed as it being a place of economics, not just but Western economics. For me, it's not a natural ecosystem. Yep. Because it's human-made, it was built by the military, it's not a natural space. As an ecologist, it worries me deeply that it's framed as being an extension of being the Earth's ecosystem. I know where it comes from, and I know it's done from a good intention. So, I mean, for me, talking about space sustainability, it's a little bit talking about the world or the universe. It's too broad. Yeah. And people can get quite frustrated with me because I will say the word is too nebulous. It's not helpful unless you're using it with a small group of people. And people say, oh, it's semantics, but it's not, because when you're using it, you're framing it with a set way of thinking. And I would argue constantly against the idea that space economics then suddenly morphs into space sustainability, and it's leading it. And it's not that I disrespect people's point of view, it's the fact that it comes in with stealth, and it's not just laid on the table. So when people will talk about, say, space sustainability, within a few minutes, economics comes in. Now, economics is actually econometrics now. So I studied Adam Smith, who's a moral philosopher. Adam Smith would not particularly like the current space economics. And it probably seems like I've gone off from the question that you're asking me, but it is, everything is done by stealth with it, because it's just a catch-all term, and I've seen people silenced by it. If you're a group of people where you've got a different definition, you're silenced because you're told that's not the definition. Now, that's not a dialogue. It's so complicated, this world that we live in. And also, you were talking about space. I mean, I look at the environmental impact of burning satellites up on the atmosphere. That's one specific world. And it's just multiple different worlds that sometimes never cross over. And I think it's creating silos. And one thing from all the work that I do in disciplines, you never get consensus. People say, oh, we've had consensus. You don't get consensus. You've silenced the minority voices. So going back to space sustainability, it's one of the biggest tools that I hear when I'm sitting in government meetings, where people will be silenced because they're looking for one meaning of it.
In a way, it's become politicized, hasn't it?
I think it's always been politicized.
Well, it's like a poster child now, isn't it, for let's talk about this. Oh, we're going to talk about sustainability, and we can apply it now by making comparisons to what's happening on Earth. And if we apply it to low Earth orbit, for example, then we'll find a solution. Ria, you're itching to make a point. I've been watching it. Over to you, sir.
Right, so Fiona mentioned consensus and talking about semantics, but it's important that we have consensus about space sustainability and how to mitigate the problem that we have. And that's another thing we're never going to have consensus of. First of all, what we need would be data, accurate data, to know where everything is. Obviously, there are military satellites. We're never going to know where they are. We're never going to have that information. There are countries who are not going to contribute because they don't want to tell us where their assets are and what kind of satellites they have. So policy would be important, regulation would be important, but there would have to be consensus, and we're not likely going to achieve that, unfortunately.
That's obviously I won't say a defeatist view, but it's a slightly negative view. Perhaps it may be representative of the sector. Thank you, Fiona.
Sorry,
I saw
doing that.
The eyebrows went up there if anybody's watching the video later. But surely, though, there must be is there some low-hanging fruit, to use a cliche, pardon me, which we can grab onto? Is it the notion of the reusable rocket? Everybody saw what happened 6-8 weeks ago. Great stuff, etc. Do we have to have an event which anchors further initiatives? Do we have to have mechanisms in place to reduce or extend the lifespan of rockets, etc.? Just a thought, or rather satellites, because if we just talk in these philosophical ivory tower perspectives, which that's my language now, not what we're saying here, going back to what you're saying about silos, we have to do something tangible. I remember in our very first episode of the series, we talked about the benefits of space. Are we failing to communicate them? Trying to find some communication which people can understand could be a catalyst of change. Sorry, I was a bit preachy there, but Fiona.
The thing is with space is that there's multiple different worlds going on at the same time, and you need all of them. So you need the people building stuff regardless of what's going on. You need people that are questioning the ethics. You need people developing policy or regulation. That's less of my interest, because I tend to look at the everyday world. So you need everything. You need people sitting in a room having these debates about what is space sustainability. But there's also this issue that there seems to be this thing that people say we just have to do anything. And I think that is definitely something you have to avoid, because sometimes you have to not do anything. Sometimes you have to sit quietly and not just jump into things, because often you can't read, you have a conversation or a discussion starts and it becomes Chinese whispers. So whether you're focusing on building different new rocket launches, you're just going to get on and do that regardless of me sitting in a room doing philosophy of technology. We may talk to each other about it. But they're different speeds. There are different worlds that have to carry on at the same time.
So are we too early to come to a firm decision as to how best to deal with it?
I don't live in this world of there's an end point. I live in a world of dialogue and discussion that just carries on constantly all the time. And we're all just trying to get up in the morning and get to the end of the day. So I don't see that there's lots of firm decisions. A lot of them end up being forced because of practicalities. So from building satellites, is that we can talk as much as we want about mitigating light pollution or radio noise for astrophysics. But at the end of the day, what makes the decision of launching, I'm moving into your field, launching rockets, it's cost, it's mass, it ends up being quite simple decisions, and depends who's funding you. If you've got a venture capitalist who wants a quick return on investment, or if you've got somebody else who has more time to invest in for longer technology, then you might get more sophisticated concepts. But then I'm definitely moving into your fields.
Well, I think it's probably only reasonable to say, Ray, you feel on that?
Yeah, it is a complicated issue. I think there is some aspect of looking at some analogies of what we've done so far in our human species. So we've never enacted a law that protects our oceans regarding sustainability. And what do we treat it as? We treat it as a big dumping ground for all of our waste, and there is no agreement, a law of sustainability for the seas. Now, if you take that analogy for space, we can't do that for space because, we would literally, if we don't have some sort of regime that stops the uncontrolled abuse of space with debris, and we don't have consequences, we won't be able to launch the equivalent of the boat or use the ecosystem, because the space debris problem will stop us from doing that. So we're in a very similar but very different environment at the moment, and the technological push also means that we as a species have a responsibility for the Earth ecosystem as well. So there's huge topics around sustainability. But I think the push is financial, it's technological, it's aspirational, it's got the aspects of ethical elements, as you mentioned. So these elements should be discussed in debate so that we can start to get some things right. Because if you don't communicate these issues and elaborate the challenges and the opportunities, there is always a compromise. That's human life. People say, concrete is a pollutant on the earth at the moment, but we've developed concrete through our progression, through becoming, a species that live and have developed this technology. So it's such a delicate subject, and I think what you're highlighting is, because it's so difficult to define, because it's so broad, this is such an important point for the space sector to consider, and we should preempt that by advancing the discussions to mitigate any issues that we can, knowing that maybe we can't mitigate everything, but we should have the advanced knowledge of some of the lessons learned that we've learnt, we hope, in the ecosystem, knowing that we won't have all the answers, but we can at least maybe set a roadmap of signposts that will guide us. I think that would be an element that I would suggest, listening to my two colleagues on the subject.
So I've got a question for Ria. At the beginning of this, you talked about your interest in I call it deep space missions. Elon Musk sending off those fortunate individuals to go to Mars. Will sustainability have to be a direct consequence of those being successful? Because you can't take all the stuff with you. You have to be able to reuse to sustain yourself living on Mars.
That's one of the ideas that they came up with, yes, to use and reuse what we already have in space. And that's one reason we're going to the moon, because that's where they're actually going to re-engineer the things that we already have in space and then possibly take them to Mars. Can I just touch on one thing that Ray said? He talked about communication and compared space to Earth's oceans. I think one important thing that we have to do, and that's why I have my channels, reaching out to people who don't necessarily know about space, because other than the space industry and astronomers, astrophysicists, engineers, not a lot of people know what happens in space. I used to work as a space journalist for 3 years, and there was this older lady who asked me what I did for a living in Ireland 2 years ago, and I said I was a space journalist, and he just couldn't stop laughing. And I was like, I'm sorry, what's so funny about that? And she was like, well, what's happening in space? Like, there's a rocket launch every 10 years, and we've been to the moon once. And I was like, no, that's so not the case. We have rocket launches almost every day now. And we've been to the moon more than once, but people just don't have the information. So they don't know what's going on in space. They don't know what the problems are. They don't think about, when they use their banking, GPS, or, watch TV, broadcasting services, they don't think about where that comes from, that we need satellites for that. And nowadays we need satellites for mitigating climate change problems on Earth as well, because we have Earth observation satellites and radars that help us. So I think it's important to educate people as well as have these conversations within the industry and academia and policymakers.
Fiona, I'm sure you've got something to say about that.
But
it's why
okay,
we're
so
chatting.
you're bringing up one of my greatest things that makes me sure is this comparison of the sea and the marine to space. So when you talk about and this thing about laws, now this is Western laws. This is not. There's been many local laws to do with marine. I mean, I come from working with indigenous forest groups in Papua New Guinea, so you have lots of shamanic rituals, areas you can and can't go into, which actually mirror a lot of Western kind of forestry. Good practice, not bad. But there's this, I understand where it comes from. There's this need for people to love space because it feels it's been understood, but it's become, for me, very reified. It's become like a cult. And comparing satellite comms to space exploration, which I'm not a fan of, because myself is about land colonization. It just sounds the same to me. It doesn't make sense to me. Like, if we talk about satellite communication, we talk about that, and then we suddenly, people are talking and they go from satcoms to exploration, and it's very, very hard to have a discussion where you're talking about two completely different things. But I think. So when we talk about educate, sometimes we mean tell people. So education is a dialogue. So people I find are interested in space. Some people are just not interested in it. Some people are anti it. And also, when you talk about space, people think of astronauts, and maybe you want to talk about satellite comms. So it's just this kind of generic view. I mean, I'm saying again, I don't think space sustainability is a useful concept. I think it feels very naive. It worked at one point. I don't think it works anymore. I think it causes more confusion. But I am going to go back to this marine ecosystem. It's a bit like you watch Star Trek, and they talk about as though it's a spaceship. I mean, it's an analogy. I work in extragalactic astronomy, which is way past the universe. I don't work in it. I work with my colleagues. These are a lot of ecology terms, forestry, webs. It's nothing like the Earth. It's just a way of describing a world which they can interact. I mean, I wrote a piece on why it's not like the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, that space is so completely different. And the other thing that really concerns me is that if we call it an ecosystem, it's almost like we're allowed to be there. It's our right to be there. And I still think that there are a lot of activities happening in space that we really have to question. And that a great deal of it, I mean, Copernicus, Earth observation, fantastic. But it's a tool. They're all tools. You still need boots on the ground. So it's this constant reification of comparing it to the ocean that I think there's a really darker side of it, ends up being into greenwashing. And can I say one thing? I'm really sorry.
No, it's fine.
Is that I also realise people want to call it an ecosystem because they're desperate to take the laws of the earth and extend it up environmental laws, Western environmental laws, again, with set ways of looking at it. And, but with that, I mean, the environmental laws on Earth have done very little, to be completely honest with you. UN Sustainablity goals, I will stand by this, have done very little. So we're taking on the issues that we've got on Earth, not talking to environmental ethicists, and then we're repeating it up in space, I think. So I know why people are doing it. I just think there's a really dark side to it, and it's this reification.
Is it almost a case of...
Sorry for using that word.
No, it's fine. The whole point of getting three people together like to discuss this is because we don't know the answers. I'm just thinking what you were saying then. Because we are so ignorant, we don't know where to start. That's why we're perhaps migrating the earthbound framework of comprehension to something which, quite frankly, boggles my mind if I think for a bit about it too long. Because if you don't do anything like that, you're almost giving into it, aren't you? You're almost giving into certain characters going out there and, I wouldn't say colonizing different planets. It's land grabs, let's be quite blunt about it. It's, can I make multiple billions of dollars out of something in 20 years' time by getting my people there first because nobody else can be bothered to get there, which is shades of sort of Western Europe in the 16th century going across to North America and into Africa, etc. But it's exactly that. It's Christopher Columbus with magnetic boots and shiny suits on, isn't it? It's I think, as simple as that. But are we just being too pessimistic? Do we just have to grab something and pray to God that we can actually get some catalyst for change? You know, it's all about tangibility, isn't it? Because
change for what?
Catalyst for change. For me personally, and it's funny, as the facilitator of starting conversation, it's always good to hear of people, but it's nice to have a little rabbit as well. We're trying to make it minimal damage, I suppose, mitigate the problems we're causing. When we were chatting before the meetings, before we started here today, we talked about the Everest effect. So we know that unless things are going to be done fairly rigorously, the moon, or parts of the moon, are going to look like junkyards, you know, with discarded kit, etc. But if we just take perhaps a broad philosophical approach, yes, we're intellectually stimulating ourselves, but we're not actually doing anything tangible to reduce the impact, the damage we're causing. Sorry, the roles have been reversed here.
But then I will ask you, but why are we doing all this? So, like, why are we going to the moon to mine? Like, so people will come back and say, but so you can maintain your lifestyle on Earth. And I'm like, I don't necessarily want to maintain the lifestyle on Earth. You know, we're taking poisonous manufacturing processes and putting it into space. My question is, why are we doing that on Earth?
Yeah.
So I tend to like go back. Why are we actually doing this? What's the underlying assumptions? Is this the way we want to live our lives? Some people will say yes. But that's what I'm interested in, is the dialogue. So I would go back again to it's putting everything together into one pot and trying to have a conversation with it is almost impossible. But if we separate it out, let's say we start talking about, let's say I suspend my critical side of why we're launching so many things in space. Is everything completely useful? Let's say everything's useful. Then we decide we want to protect it. Well, they are protected. Leo and Geo are protected. So I, again, go with that. And then the idea behind it, okay, well, everything's a trade-off. What is it that we want to protect? Do we stop something's going up? And then if everything is there, then how do we begin to deal with it? But that's very different from people suddenly saying space sustainability and everyone goes off into their own little corners, rather than saying, let's talk about space debris, or not even just that, burning satellites up in the atmosphere. But the conversations go off and go round and round in circles because the word sustainability, I would say, it's just too nebulous.
So is it...
And Ray, you can totally disagree with me. I know.
Well, but I'll bring Ray into the conversation in a moment, but I'm just thinking, but if we... And this is to everybody now. If we don't grab onto something as a starting point, whether it's recycling, refueling, whether it's debris mitigation, human nature says, well, right, go on, you challenged me there, I'll let you go ahead.
So people keep talking about human evolution as though that's a natural part of us doing these things. So I come from social research. There's no theories to support I find people they go, humans do this, or it's part of our natural evolution. So even the things that we're doing, I want to question, why are we doing them? So I would encourage people to not say, well, it's part of our human nature. Is it?
Well, that's an interesting one.
Is it? You know, I mean, I am silenced a lot by people saying it's part of our human evolution to go to moon. There's no accepted evolutionary theory at all that says that's what we're supposed to do.
So put evolutionary theory to one side, and this is
human nature, or...
Well, there's so many different corridors this conversation can go off.
I think we should just state that's what we want to do,
Yeah.
right? Not use a little platform to say, oh, that's humans, is to get rid of that and say, this is what we think we want to do because of this, this, and this. That is a much easier platform to have a philosophical debate from. But if you start from human nature, you've silenced everybody who doesn't then think that.
Then I apologise for that.
No, I mean, it's...
arrogant in inverted commas phrase. Everybody's curious. Whether you're a small lad in 1969 watching the landings, etc., or whether you're, what is on the other side of the universe, how does a black hole work, what can we do on the moon? So I think when I talk about human nature, we're curious, which is why we go over the hill to see what's on the other side, which is why we go underwater. And going up to space is just another example of that, but it's slightly glossier and got shiny things. Ria, what's your take on all of this? Because, you know, whether you're talking... I'm going to ask you a feeling about debris mitigation, because I'm going to grab onto something now, because surely there are things we can do about that in order to come back to making it a cleaner, safer place. We'll come back to you in a minute, Fiona.
Yeah.
Sure.
I agree with Fiona on a lot of points. So I don't think that a lot of things that we're doing in space are necessary, and that's horrible to say because this is my job. But so it's not necessary. I come from a country that was a socialist country until I was 4 years old, so I grew up without a lot of technical stuff, and it was fine. Life was easier, it was slower. You know, we don't necessarily need to go to the moon. We don't necessarily need mega constellations of satellites now. So we used to have a few satellites, and companies and countries would share those satellites, and they had designated times where they could use them. And now everyone is launching their own because they became smaller, they became cheaper to launch. It's easier, and now everyone's having mega constellations, and we're talking about hundreds of thousands of satellites per country. That's the plan. Obviously, not every country is going to do that, but you know, whoever can will. But since we're doing that, and I don't know if it's human nature or not, but I don't think they're going to stop doing that. We need to find common ground to protect LEO and GEO, to mitigate these issues, to prevent collisions that will create more space debris and that will create more collisions, especially now that but certain countries will have... I'm distancing myself from it now, thank you. You changed my mind. So a lot of countries are sending commercial space stations up in the next few decades. So the more space debris there is, the more in danger human life in LEO will be because of that. So the ISS has been impacted by space debris multiple times. The robotic arm had a hole punched through it, for example. There's a crack on one of the windows on the ISS because of space debris. They have to evacuate the ISS, I think, 4 to 6 times a year at least, because of space debris. So we're endangering human lives up there as well. So we have to do something about it. But I agree with Fiona now.
So here's a question. Have we not reached our Titanic moment? The Titanic had lots of lifeboats, but there were no clear... it met the regulations in place at the time. Was it only last... back in early January, wasn't it, when that ring from one of the launchers fell down and narrowly missed the Kenyan village, etc.
They think, there's a bit of a question about what it actually was.
Okay, whether it was this or that. The point I was probably going to suggest was nobody's died yet who is considered to be important enough. And it's not going to be perhaps until some object up there hits a Western city, hits somebody who is media savvy, media friendly, are we going to start perhaps to hear the clamour, which is another conversation altogether, the knee-jerk reaction to doing something? That's just a thought.
But that's an interesting point, isn't it? Where they deorbit, control deorbit, and re-entry is where they choose to do it.
So here's a question.
Which most of it is uncontrolled. Most of it will be uncontrolled as well because it's cheaper and easier, especially from Leo. But when they choose, I should put that back to you. But how they're choosing where, apart from Point Nemo, where of course.
So there's space debris falling back on Earth
all the time.
All the time. Like I think it was last week or 2 weeks ago when it fell in Kenya somewhere.
Is it mid-January?
Yeah. So it's not fun and games. Deorbiting also messes with our atmosphere because they use material when they build these spacecraft. They use material that when they burn up in our atmosphere produce harmful gases, for example, which is not good for our atmosphere. So we're actually polluting our atmosphere with spacecraft as well, not just with the launches, because they're coming up with eco-friendly propellants, but with the material that these spacecraft are built from.
Okay.
Fiona.
So that's what I study, is the Vinberg. So what's interesting is that we don't know.
Yeah.
We don't know what it is. And I think that we talked about this earlier, there's another sort of ritual in space, which I would say this idea about not being negative, you've got to be positive all the time, and it turns into PR, spin and hype. So I'm particularly interested in this topic, and nobody wanted to talk about it about 6-7 years ago, and now everyone's talking about it, which is just as difficult, because we need to work out what we do and don't know, and how we deal with it, which may not be scientific research, it may be philosophical discussion about whether we think it's a trade-off to have mega satellites that we're going to deorbit, especially since it's gone from 25 years down to 5 years for deorbiting. But I mean, the irony behind it is, of course, you have to prove that your satellite will demise before you get a launch license. So that's also a bit of a question.
But that's an interesting topic. So aside from the philosophical discussion of exploration as a curious result of what we're doing in space today, it is a fact we are in space. So we have to deal with the reality of the fact that we're already there, we are polluting the oceans, we are in this dynamic. So my challenge to Fiona would be, knowing that we are a given set of situations, what mitigation can we do to minimize our impact in terms of impact on the environment, whether you call that sustainability or something else, that I take your point on. But the key thing there is, we do have, and you just alluded to it, rules that are changing as we learn. For example, the 25-year rule of deorbiting low Earth orbiting satellites has now changed to 5 years.
For US endeavours.
Yeah, but those come about through legal systems that we generally adhere to that have legal consequences and financial consequences on the actors or countries involved. So there are legal constructs around the way we use, ecosystem is the wrong word to use, the space, environment, whatever you want to call it. So there are elements of legal frameworks that we have, which are completely outdated, by the way, as we all know. So, we have the Moon Treaty, we have other legal constructs that we're trying to use, which are not fit for purpose, let alone, as you touched on there, we still don't know what we don't know. So the impact of space debris on the atmosphere for re-entry of not just elements of debris of satellites, but we want to now turn that environment, whatever you want to call it, into an active use case that we bring stuff back. It's not just going up, it's actually coming back as a function of the industrialization process that's happening today. So what we call returns is a term that we're hearing more and more. Countries want to create value, coming back to your commercial side that's driving it. So that's having an impact on our Earth ecosystem. And as you said, there's a lot we just don't know. So my question to Fiona would be, given that we have a certain situation, given the fact we have certain limited constructs around legal and the technological and the West versus the sort of what we call indigenous aspect and view of how we push environment control as well. Given all of that known dynamic, how can we proactively mitigate how we affect this space? I don't know what the word is, but...
Cool. So I'm really interested not in regulations and laws, partly because I do genuinely think that most laws and regulations, people work around them.
Right.
Not because they're forced to, because they're forced to do it. It's not
human nature.
Nice one. So what I'm really interested in is the fact that, right, okay, let's say the US is running this, right? The US does not like regulations because it says that it stifles innovation. So let's go with the idea that the space companies generally are not into regulation. They are pushing for innovation. Let's say the US has got a lot of power. So your other options, which for me often work more, are developing shared good practice, which is easier said than done, I know, or alternative practices. So everything that you're looking at, I know that in the space industry, one thing I noticed, because I've worked in quite a few fields, there's this knee-jerk reaction to go, we need a regulation. I'm like, do you need a regulation? Or do you need to work out how people are working, what's going on, and how you can do a trade-off?
And
rather than
that
doing it because I don't think the US are absolutely anti-regulation.
And for that to happen, I agree, there's an education piece that Ria mentioned earlier, which is not a telling of what to do, but actually listening and putting the right people in places where you can debate this. So it's having an education piece, then a communication piece about debating it, and then coming up with constructs that will actually facilitate that discussion that you're saying. So there's elements of what we're discussing today that both Ria and Fiona and myself all have our different, unconscious bias on. We've come up with our own knowledge of the industry, etc. But what's key is to dialogue, communicate, but also we're very clever, the human race. We do mitigate quite clever things. So we can use that intelligence to have the debates and then move this conversation forward. But I really do think around this subject there is a lot of ignorance and a lot of interested parties. And we need to have that debate and discussion where we can, also put a lot of information on the table to also educate ourselves as we have these debates moving forward. So I think it's interesting that we're having this lively debate here about various aspects of what we can't even define what sustainability is for space because it's so broad, but actually the impacts day to day, given the fact that we're already exploring space and doing things in space commercially or, as you said, driven by, economics or not, we have to deal with these subjects.
Can I?
Please do.
You sure? Can I add one? So my background is as an ethnographer, right? So you talked about unconscious bias, right? My background is to go in with no set view, right? Yep. I know that I've got views when we're talking, but when I do research, fieldwork, I'm going in and I literally don't care what I find. I am looking to see what's happening. That is really missing. Because people seem to have this view that what they see and they think is the way that the world is. So often I hear people chatting away and they're confusing their belief with actually rigorous research.
Exactly.
And I'm going to say this about the space industry. I see a lot where I hear people at lots of different conferences, and I've got a CEO of a space company who I greatly respect, but they're talking about something that's way beyond they're guessing at things, and then it becomes kind of established. So what also I completely agree with you, is that you start to do research with the kind of work that I do, is where you're going in and you're having somebody who doesn't have a set view, and they're going in and working out what is actually happening. Because normally, unless you're studying it, it is never like you think it is at all. I've done stuff in medicine and forestry, and the world is just, and I don't think we are very clever, unfortunately. I'd like to think that we are.
Do you think on that point, do you think there are any lessons learned from other sectors that you've worked in that we can apply to the space sector that can guide us in doing this a little bit better?
I think that we can learn a lot, not from a little bit of, when people talk about ethics, there's actually a whole field, rigorous field of environmental ethics. And I never see them in the room. And I often ask to come into a room as an ethicist, and they're like, oh, it's fine, we can do it. Because there's a misunderstanding what ethics is. They think it's what I think I know when I've heard people saying, and they're going, I will not, somebody was talking about why we should go to the moon, and they just said we should go to the moon, it's part of human evolution, and if we don't do it, it's unethical. That is not an ethical discussion.
No. Well, let me ask the question, you know, and this was what my son suggested the other day. He said, why do we keep doing so much stuff into space? Do we really need to do it? Is it useful doing it? I mean, we talk about analog missions, but that's another story. Is it becoming too on trend? Can we not look at doing stuff back on Earth, you know, rather than sending rockets with what's the word I'm looking for? Telescopes. Thank you very much indeed.
The Limborn telescopes.
This is like, give us a clue, isn't it? But can we not have them mounted on high-altitude balloons, for example? Are we trying to put up too much stuff? Ria, what do you think?
Oh. Well, if we talk about telescopes, I think that's another thing that you're researching or you looked into, or as an astrophysicist, you know that the more satellites there are up there, the harder it is for astronomers to do research from Earth. But then again, that's just optical telescopes.
Yeah.
So we have
and radio.
Yeah, and radio, true. So I don't know. Research-wise, I think it's good that we're launching. I think it's good that we're curious. I think it's good that we're trying to understand where we came from, and we need to launch spacecraft for that because, you know,
we can't get the answers on Earth.
Yeah,
we
exactly.
Can't see it. Yeah.
Exactly. But as for the industry, as Fiona has converted me, I say that a lot of things that we launch are not necessary. Then again, space stations, I think they're useful. Not saying necessary, but they're useful because we do a lot of research on these space stations that could be beneficial for us on Earth and that have already been beneficial for us on Earth.
And let me put another question to you. We all talk about manned missions, etc., in the sense of humans travelling on spacecrafts. Where do we think the use of robotics is going to go? Because I was talking to one person the other week up in Scotland, and they were saying, you know, Bruce, Elon Musk will need 3.5 feet of water around the living compartments of his rocket to protect people, or the equivalent of. And so I said, well, why didn't you send a rocket? Rockets don't die. No, a robot, pardon me, sorry, it's been one of those days. Robots don't die. Robots are becoming increasingly more sophisticated in terms of the integration between what the robot is experiencing and what we can experience as a consequence of haptics, etc. Do we think there's going to be a change in how missions are orientated, or we are going to still have people going boldly where they haven't boldly gone before, and robot will come a little bit later?
Well, having a background in space robotics, maybe I can give an angle on that. But just to put that into perspective, it's an interesting debate, and it's a debate that, you know, is one of the fundamentals. You know, you either are for robotics or humans. I think that's completely wrong. I think the aspect of technology, robotics is just a tool, and robots and humans will go into the cosmos together, and they're already doing it. And as I said, that's just historical, and also, you know, since we first picked up a tool, whether you call a satellite a robot or a big arm that's robotically controlled from the space station a robot, or whether you call a satellite a robot in itself, because they're all functioning so-called intelligent machines. They have methods of control, they have their sensors, and they do stuff. So my personal view is we are developing further tools, which you call robotics, that will facilitate our exploration of space. They will also allow us to mitigate aspects of the debris that we will, you know, consequentially create by going into space. So to separate the two, I think, is wrong. I think it has always been a combined thing. But I think the development of robotics is really at a pivot point change. So we have to recognize what's happening with AI, what's happening with software, what's happening with technology. And these things are all happening by chance also on Earth. You know, we're having robotics affect all of our lives on Earth, and it's also affecting space. So the difference in space is it's just a more extreme environment, in the sense that the robotics is more able to survive than a human can without the protections of our, you know, necessary life support system. But the interaction of robotics and humans I think is just a natural consequence of where we are today. Whatever has preceded that, take that as a granted or whatever, but it will evolve. And it's an exciting part because with some aspects of robotics, you can mitigate some aspects of what we're doing. And we're learning, and the interface between robotics and humans is such a fascinating and fast-moving section of way we're going, including a lot of bits of AI that are really coming to the fore because people are suddenly hitting on to this idea that AI can help us in so many different things. Also, AI has its good and bad points, and we can debate that till the cows come home. But looking at the elements that focus to the space industry development in the short term, I really believe that we will use robotics and humans in a cooperative, not separate method to do what we're doing in space, whether it be communicating from satellites to Earth, doing exploration, robotic elements on human space stations, weather satellites, technology, all of the different elements of the space ecosystem will have a robotic angle. And I think it's important that we understand the technology. So there's a learning aspect of this. There's an education piece again. And I just think it's another tool that we have to learn to understand how we can move forward with. So I don't know what my colleagues think about the robotics and human debate, but it's always an interesting
we're not
debate.
talking Terminators here. We're talking, robotics, is it a way of protecting people in space and keeping them safe, or is it a way of doing things going further than we could possibly do? Ria, there's lots of bubbling questions here.
Okay, I just want to talk about the astronauts. Mm-hmm. So I have interviewed quite a few of them, and I know or kind of have an idea what kind of people they are. And they are very curious, and they will want to go. So even if, robotics could do the job, they will want to go.
To experience it.
Yeah. To experience it, exactly. I spoke to one of them. I'm not going to mention his name because it was not official. But I asked him if he would go to Mars if it was just a one-way ticket. And he said, without thinking, that's his life. That's what he wants. And if he could do this for humanity and he could send back information that, robots couldn't see and he can see and he can experience, then he would do it happily.
So there's room for emotion in space?
Yeah, sure.
Go on, please do.
Okay, so you've actually gone into what was my main topic when I worked in medicine, is bodies and AI. And so AI, to me, it's not intelligent because we don't know how we learn, full stop. Robotics, the question always is it extending humans or is it trying to replace us? Now, you'll get that in the robotics side of it. And it depends who's doing it. You give us for a scalpel and get us to cut a body up, we'll kill the person. You get a surgeon to do it, and they do a wonderful job of it. So everything in this room is technology to me. So I come much more from philosophy of technology is back to the ancient Greeks, that from the moment you're born and you come out, everything around you is technology, with its clothing. And the question is that you're trying to extend your senses, not just your sight, so to look at visual, but all your senses. So this does go back to robotics about whether it's useful or not. Let's say we're not going to let the astronauts have a vanity project, so they're not being sent up there because they're really expensive. They're really expensive. So let's say we send astronauts up with robotics because only they can do that, because of a lot of knowledge is iterative, it's instinctive, it's practical, what they call practical, ancient Greeks call practical wisdom, all the stuff that you cannot teach, but you have to learn.
And a lot of knowledge happens by accident.
Well, and we talked about this as well. So I always keep thinking, I won't go into the medical side of it, but do you remember when Neil Armstrong was, which shuttle they were crashing and he saved it? Which one was that again?
Oh, God.
Oh, the Apollo mission.
Yes, that's right.
That was Apollo 11, so he took over.
Yeah, so if you spoke to his pilot, he was an engineer, and he didn't use anything at all, and whoever was with him said he couldn't have done that because he wasn't an engineer. And Neil Armstrong the actual whole shuttle was an extension of his body and his thoughts and his thinking. And he was able to make those decisions. Now, whether or not it's true, because it just extended him, his knowledge, everything. And the other person said, I didn't have that. I didn't have that knowledge. I couldn't have thought that quickly.
And if he hadn't been there, it's understood that it would have been a disaster. They ran
so it
has
to, the ground, robotics has to, it's about extending, but it's not just your visual or your sight, it's all the senses. I know surgeons, they talk about, some surgeons do not like to use robotic surgery because they need all their senses and they feel using vision is not enough. So going back to the robotics, I think we'll probably agree on the same thing, is that it has to extend humans, and humans are in it. They're built in it.
You can't put the genie back in the box to be.
No, but the point with it is that there's humans in there, in the design, the algorithms who keep checking it, and you're going to have humans because they're the ones that have to keep checking the errors that keep coming out.
They're complementary systems.
Yeah, I see them. If you have the right person and the right design. Yeah. So the astronauts can go only if the robotics and the AI, I know they probably can't ever replace them.
We're rapidly approaching the end of episode 2. This has gone off in a direction which I could not have anticipated. Speaking with you each individually before we met up today, you all had quite clear views. But what's interesting, you've been absorbing and taking on board. I can't remember the exact words you said, Ria, but I think you agreed or you've been converted to a particular view. And if that's something you can just take away from today, then I think we've achieved it. What I'd like, one last question, one last thought, one last question from you all. Are you optimistic about the future of space? And we talked about sustainability, the challenges of trying to define that and what steps. But intrinsically, that this progress we're taking part, whether it's human nature, whether it's human evolution, or whether it's curiosity, are you okay about it? Are you optimistic?
I am. I think, whether you believe it or not, I believe that we are intelligent and we are clever, and we do have certain aspects of us. We are also crazy and we have our negative points as well. But given that all together, I am an optimist. And I think the nice thing about the space environment or ecosystem, or just the subject matter, it's just boundless, it's endless. And the human curiosity for not only exploration, but also information about what are we living in terms of the ecosystem of the universe is just so exciting. We're discovering things from ground-based, from space-based sensors. We are advancing algorithms and AI and software that can relook at data that we've already seen years and years ago. We're able to use certain aspects of the development of the human species that is really pushing the boundaries. And I think, of course, everything can be used in different vocations. So there's always a darker side to elements of the capabilities of what we do, but that always exists. But I think on balance, yes, I am an optimist, and I think that we have an amazing capability with, if we are clever and we mitigate certain issues around whether you call it sustainability or whether you call it something else, I think the future is bright. Definitely do believe that. So I am an optimist, to answer your question. And a rocket Ria, cutting edge of all communication on the digital platforms. Your thoughts?
I'm Hungarian, so I'm naturally pessimistic. No, I'm with Ray on the technological development. So obviously a lot of exciting things are happening, and I'm optimistic on that side. If we talk about a sustainable space environment, I'm not so optimistic, but we'll see. I think we would have to take money out of the equation for me to be optimistic, and we'll never be able to do that.
And the last word, if I may, hand back to you, Fiona.
Optimistic.
The catalyst for many of these conversations. What's your view?
Well, again, I'm a Scot as well.
I spent 8 years in Scotland.
So we're not trained to be in Calvinist background. Very happy with that. Coming from the environmental field, and I'm wearing my birds, I tend to wear things, I am really worried. I'm very worried about the Earth, really am. And I see us replicating the same colonial issues, land grab up in space. Technologically, I think there's some amazing things coming out. I'm in astrophysics. I think they're not all of them are words. Some of them are quite words, especially radio, and it is quite serious. We can't really brush it off. I can't say that I'm optimistic. I'm really sorry. I'm not going to apologise. I don't feel optimistic yet. But I'm hoping that people will start listening a little bit more and maybe looking outside of the field of space to begin to look at things.
An optimist, and that's the challenge for the future of our space debates in the future. So maybe there's two conversions here.
It's about dialogue, isn't it?
Yeah,
I think my thing is dialogue, right? And that's what I feel less optimistic about. Sometimes I don't feel that I'm hearing dialogue. I hear the same message again from the same people. Good. And it ends up being PR, hype, and rhetoric, and not dialogue.
I'm just going to say this has been probably one of the more thoughtful episodes we've put together on this. As I said in passing, it's not about shiny suits, space hats and magnetic boots. There's some really very, very interesting issues which we have barely scratched the surface on. But I would love to say thank you, all of you, for coming along today. Let's pick this up in season 2. And with that, we've come to the end of episode 2 of Lift Off. This one has been an absolute scorcher of one, if you don't mind me saying. All of you out there in the community, please like, subscribe, and link up so you can hear more news on the next episode. It's going to be a good one. We're talking about Generation Alpha, but we'll save that for later. So it's Bruce Poston, signing off from Lift Off, and looking forward to seeing you on the next episode.